Welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. I'm Kaylee Fretz, joined as always by Ronan McLaughlin. Ronan, who are we talking to today? Or I should say, who were we talking to 6 months ago?
6 months ago, we were talking to an Escape Collective member, Jack Aitken. Jack is, well, I could just say he's like a motorsports professional, but I'll give him a better intro than that. He's 2015 Formula Renault Eurocup champion, competed in GP3, competed in FIA Formula 2. He was then a Renault F1 test driver and sort of became more widely known as Williams F1 reserve driver. He is also an F1 driver, having raced the 2020 Sakhir Gand Prix. And when we recorded this episode last July, coincidentally, on the same day that the Tour de France finished on a motor racing circuit, he was at that time doubling up driving duties with IMSA's Whelen Cadillac Racing and TTM's Emil Frey Racing. Yeah, so he's driving a Cadillac in America and a Ferrari in Europe, basically, which doesn't sound too bad, really.
That sounds good and proper. Yeah.
Sounds like a nice way to make a living, I guess.
So he's a very fast driver, which means that he spends quite a bit of time thinking about how to drive even faster, I would imagine. That's kind of why we wanted to talk to him, right?
Yeah, it's a slightly different episode this week. It's a special episode coinciding with the start of the Formula 1 season. And we did record this before we had decided what exactly Performance Process was going to become. I don't even know if we had the name at that point, but yeah, this is one of the sort of initial episodes that we had recorded. And as such, it's not, this episode could have fitted into Geek Warning, could have fitted into Placeholders, could have fitted into Performance Process. Eventually, we've sort of decided to run it here in Performance Process. There is some talk about, transferable skills and benefits of cycling to driving and vice versa. But mostly it's just a talk with another sports professional who, I should also say that Jack is a huge cycling fan, cycles quite a bit, has, like, this time last year, I know he was doing Strade Bianche Gran Fondo. This time last year, he was also one of the first people to sign up as an Escape Collective member. And
thank you, Jack.
Yeah, he's also like, he's a huge cycling fan. You can tell that just from listening to the episode. And so this is just sort of a general talk. And I sort of kicked it off with a question I've had for a long time, is like, what is the fascination for Formula 1 drivers with cycling? And why do they all love cycling? So that sort of kicks off on a long sort of meandering conversation back and forth between cycling and Formula 1 and motorsport and back again. And we talk about, as I mentioned, like the sort of transferable skills from one sport to the other. We even touch on like the leakage of expertise and design and engineering talent from Formula 1 into cycling and what's sort of motivating that. At one point I called Jerry Anderson twice or three times. So if you hear that and you're wondering who is Jerry Anderson, it's actually Gary Anderson. I'm talking about the legendary Formula 1 designer. Turns out I wasn't even talking about him. I was talking about Adrian Newey. So anyway, that was that was a bit of a and then we even touch on the sort of environmental endeavors that motorsport making and how they're maybe focusing those endeavors in the wrong areas, and likewise in cycling. We even briefly touch on how breathable his underwear is. And finally, we sort of wrap up with a discussion on...
That was my question, so...
We finally wrap up on a sort of conversation about rules, and who doesn't love talking about rules? So FIA rules, UCI rules, their application, this, that, and the other. It was a good old time.
Wow. A wide-ranging conversation. Maybe not quite like a normal performance process where you're going to get some tangible things out of it, but just a really fascinating chat. So that's why it's a special episode, and we hope you enjoy. Let's jump over to your conversation with Jack.
Well, Jack, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us here today.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm going to kick off with a pretty obvious question, and it's probably one that a lot of people have asked themselves down through the years. There seems to be, compared to other sports, there seems to be this link with F1 drivers and motorsport drivers in general, and their love for cycling. So many of you guys all ride bikes. Can you tell me what the fascination is? Because it seems to us like, you maybe have it the wrong way around. The driving is maybe the exciting part.
I think it's a two-way thing, because I have, just to go about before I answer the question, one of my teammates this year lives in Andorra, because just like for cycling, it's a great hub for Europe. and there's, I think, some other financial benefits as well.
So here,
But yeah, so I hear. But you don't get the rain like you do in the UK, so why would you leave? But anyway, he lives there in the UK, in Andorra, and he loves his cycling, and as such has gotten to know a few of the pros around there and does go on rides with them. And he says that the only thing that they talk about on those rides are either coffee or cars. Meanwhile, the racing driver is there saying, "What wheel should I get next?" Or "What about these tires?" Or, just obsessing over bikes. And it's completely the other way around for the riders. So
is it a case
yeah,
of the grass is always greener or something like that?
must be. Yeah. Or I think it's more to do with work versus pleasure, right? As much as an amazing job it is to be a racing driver or a professional cyclist, it's still going to be work at the end of the day. And as silly as that sounds, at some point you get a little bit bored of it. We obviously still love it because that's what we do for a living, and you couldn't do it to such a high level if you didn't love it. But having hobbies on the side that you don't have to take so seriously is quite nice, and having freedom of choice, like for a racing driver, for example, like myself, often if you're associated with a brand such as Cadillac, for me, you're kind of locked into loving Cadillacs. And that's fine because Cadillac makes some fine, fine cars. But I can't really be seen going out and enjoying a Porsche on social media or a Lamborghini or what have you. And it's going to be the same for a rider, I guess. They're kind of locked into their equipment and doing things in training in team kit all the time. And it's just nice to mess around with different stuff and not have those constraints. The fascination for me and for drivers, I think, is the feeling of speed is there because you're kind of exposed to the elements, and a bike is such an efficient way to get from A to B that it's kind of pleasurable in that sense, even if you're not really, really going fast. And it's a good training tool. I got into it, and a lot of others did because it's good cardio for the car. It's easy on your body. You can, sit and do 2-3 hours quite easily, like you would in an endurance race stint. So all of those tick the box, as do you can be social. It's more my level of mechanicking versus an actual car. My mechanics wouldn't let me within 10 feet of my race car with a spanner, but I can do what I want to my bike. And, I regularly mess that up, but sometimes I can actually do stuff on my own, which is quite nice.
That sort of work versus social element of it's not something I considered. I just assumed it was much like the rest of us. We just enjoy the thrill of a bike ride, enjoy getting outdoors, and it's exercise, it's social and all that. You mentioned there the training element of it. I think that's probably very relevant to, you did Le Mans a few weeks ago, the world's ultimate endurance car race. If I don't think I'm overstating it in saying that. And then, cycling being such an endurance sport, I guess there's a natural link there. But do you feel that being a bike rider and bike riding more often actually makes you a better driver on track? And maybe vice versa, do you feel that, being a professional racing driver makes you a better cyclist? I'm thinking maybe in terms of, line selection through corners and being more aware on the road and just everything that goes into, being a bike rider outdoors versus being a bike rider on an indoor trainer or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the fundamentals are the same because at the end of the day, you have a contact patch with a rubber tire, and you have controls that you can use to manipulate it. And pretty much straight away, when I got on a bike and started going on rides with friends and doing little descents or taking corners, it was clear that I could carry over a lot of that natural feeling, if you like, to the bike of having a rough sense of where the limit was. What I quite quickly learned is when you go over the limit in a car and the tire slides, that's often just part and parcel of going fast. And in extreme cases, yeah, you'll spin or crash, but you have to get it quite wrong. Whereas if you start sliding a tire in a bike, it goes wrong quite quickly. And I have the road
There's not
rash
much chance of saving it, is there?
No, yeah, and it hurts more, usually anyway. But yeah, I think a lot of the same things apply of line choice, knowing basics like if there's a bit of camber in the road, that's going to help you. Knowing that tire pressure is something that you need to keep an eye on. If you go out on tires that have been sat there for months and are a little bit saggy, then it's probably not a great idea to start bombing descent. And when I go competitive riding, like I do racing sometimes, rarely, but more often just fast rides with friends. It's one of the things that I try and use to my advantage. And I've definitely got slower though over the years. In the 4 years I've been riding a bike, I don't take as many risks as I used to.
I think that's just called getting old, isn't it?
Yeah, probably.
I say that with no idea what age you are, but I know that's definitely the case for me.
27 now. Yeah.
You mentioned there just, line selection and that's one of the things, having started sim racing about a year ago, I've noticed that my line selection on the bike has, dramatically changed. And
Okay.
for the better, I think. You'll be the expert here. How similar are line choices from car to bike? And how much do you think bike riders, watching something like the Tour de France today, how much do you think bike riders could benefit from maybe, a closer look, or maybe even some coaching from the likes of professional drivers like yourselves?
They're pretty similar because all the mechanics are very much the same. How you achieve it is different in terms of a steering wheel with four tires versus your bars, lean angles, and two wheels. It generally means, so when I first jumped on a bike, for example, it took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around. You have to start the corner earlier because you have to almost turn the opposite way to the corner to tip the weight over on the bike, and then you get into the corner. But other than that, line choice is very similar. I think, yeah, people would benefit from it. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a racing driver. I think, a pro rider would be able to give the same advice and the same tips. I have a funny story. I have actually done a cornering clinic for my local club,
All right.
um, which is based in Oxford, called the Cowley Road Condors, and they're great, very friendly bunch. And they asked if I would do a cornering clinic because they had the same thought process as you. And I was like, I guess I'll do it. I don't know if I'm really qualified in the world of bikes, but we'll give it a go. And I did my best, and we were out there for a couple of hours on a 3-corner little course. It was a little bit cold and damp, so I was like, let's just take it easy. We're just going through the theory of it. No need to actually test the limits and put yourselves at risk, because the last thing I wanted is to say to someone, push it, and then they go off, because there's no need for that. But I think was making progress. People started saying, "Oh, well, head off home. Starting to get late." I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll come with you. I'll head home too." Last corner to head back onto the road back into Oxford, and I thought I'll just give it a go. And obviously, front wheel just did that horrible little slip and feeling of complete weightlessness before sliding out and taking some skin off, and in front of pretty much the whole class as well. So I showed them how not to do it. Slightly
Oh,
undermined my authority, I think. Maybe everything that I taught them in the last hour just went
completely
out the window.
disregarded.
Yeah, it wasn't a good moment. But yeah, that was a valuable lesson. Like I say, you can't slide a tire on a bike. Well, you can, but I can't. I'm not that skilled.
Yeah, it's probably best avoided for the vast majority of us, I think.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of things there had me thinking just about you guys are having to be so particular about your car setup. How much of that then transfers to your bike? Like, are you someone who's really delving into geometry charts, or the exact angle of your saddle, or can you jump off one bike and onto another and feel no difference? How in tune are you and other drivers with getting your bike fit dialed in absolutely perfectly?
I think it varies. I think, to be honest, it's not as transferable as you might expect. When I first started riding, when I would jump between bikes, I really couldn't feel much of a difference just because it was still something fairly new for me. Now I definitely notice the difference going between bikes and cornering now that I've gotten to know them a bit better. But I couldn't tell you what chainstay length I like, what fork rake I like, anything like that. I haven't achieved that level of knowledge. I do think one day I would love to have a custom bike once I actually know what I'm doing, but I'm not there yet. So can definitely feel it. I just don't really know what I'm feeling, if that makes sense.
I dare say there's also a bit of ignorance is bliss, in that I wish I couldn't feel that I'm
Yeah.
wearing thicker socks and as such my saddle height is lower, but that's not normal. Just going back to the general idea of, especially I think F1 drivers being really into cycling, and especially being so open and sharing so much that how much they do cycle. I have to say I love to see it. I think for the likes of yourselves, who have these huge, social media followings and fans around the world, I think it can't but help normalize the idea of bike riding on roads with what I would assume is a large proportion of your audiences that are not cyclists. So I have to say I do love to see it. I am a little worried though. Do you think, given Lance Stroll's crash on a bike where he injured both wrists and almost missed the first race of the season and did miss pre-season testing, do you think is there any chance that the teams might start slapping you guys with lines within your contracts to say you can't go bike riding in case you miss or you get injured or something like that?
There's always the chance. I think it's quite unlikely. My first ever bike not my first ever bike. I had a bike as a kid. My first proper road bike as an adult came from my race team because they were like, we have a deal with a road bike manufacturer. It was with Villiers. So we've got a bunch of these bikes for our drivers to train on. Here you go. They were actively encouraging me to go and use it. I think because they were completely ignorant of the risks. And so was I. I didn't really realize because I was living in central London then, still with my parents, was in school, took it out into central London with some flats and no idea what I was doing, and immediately put it back in the garage because I scared myself silly in the traffic. Then had a lot of good experiences that got me back into cycling after a year or two. But I think most teams weren't aware of the risk until some of these accidents started happening. Fernando Alonso was another one that had an injury. I think it was a wrist injury again. I can't remember, but preseason that kept him out of preseason testing. But I haven't seen that yet, and I certainly don't get that from my team. They don't seem to mind. It's such a useful training tool that so many drivers are doing that I think it would actually be difficult for them to stop us in a way.
Do you think it, like the likes of that crit racing, do you think, and maybe even Strava and all things like that, do you think that element of bike riding actually helps you keep your competitive instinct ticking over while you're out of the car or off the track? Obviously, you maybe don't get car racing as often as you would like. It's not exactly something you can do every day of the week. So is there any benefit in that?
I think so. I think it's like anything up to a point, it's good. I definitely have a competitive burst when I'm out of the car that I need to try and satisfy somehow, whether that's through other forms of training. Like I still run quite a lot. I go to the gym. Cycling is quite an easy place to be competitive because it's a social sport where you can race your mates, even if it's just a ride to the pub or whatever. You can do actual races, you can do time trials, you can race for comms on Strava. So it's kind of like an endless pool that you can dig into. And I have, gone too far with that as well, where my training has become quite lopsided. Like during COVID, I went completely mad with my cycling, like a lot of people did, burnt myself out. Like a lot of drivers will bring their bikes to the track, and the excuse will be, "Oh, it's a great way to get around the paddock or to and from the hotel." In reality, each night they're going out for a ride or whatever. I don't do that because I'd be just as bad if I brought the bike with me. So I just take that option away by not having it around me. But when I'm home, I indulge. I do, a little bit and wrap it in with the rest of my training program. And I have a coach who helps to keep me on the straight and narrow as well. But he is a cyclist, so he understands. So it's all good.
Going back to the teams for a second, there was this period of maybe 3-4 years ago where it seemed to be a lot of the F1 teams were partnering with World Tour cycling teams. And while it could get the attraction for the World Tour cycling team and even bike brands, we hear a lot of them working with F1 research and development units. But I've always wondered what the attraction was for F1 teams. And my theory was that it was perhaps a bit of a budget cap workaround, and that if they got a bike into the wind tunnel, at least it was maybe more time and understanding the wind tunnel and getting runs to correlated in that. But just wondering if you had any idea what the attraction was for F1 teams when we seen. I think we had McLaren with Bahrain Merida, and there was a few other
McLaren and Specialized.
And a few others also. Yeah, so I'm kind of wondering what the attraction was for the F1 side of it.
I think the simple answer is at the end of the day, almost all of these partnerships tend to be brought on by the marketing department and partner management and agencies that are looking for matchups. And cycling and F1 and the technologies around, especially with the advent of carbon fiber in cycling, suddenly it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's the same technologies, similar end goals of increasing efficiency, aerodynamics. In reality, I think the usefulness for teams is pretty limited. It could well be. I hadn't thought about the wind tunnel side of things. I actually ride with a wind tunnel engineer from Alpine. He hasn't mentioned anything like that because they're another one. Alpine partner with Lapierre. And I think, I'm not sure, a lot of these teams have been running the same wind tunnel for a long time, so they should have enough historical data, but it could be. Yeah, I think the simple answer is it's just the creation of marketing agencies are like, that looks like it would be a good idea. Maybe there's a bit of cash passing hands as well. But I just remember when I was at now Alpine, it was Renault at the time. We had a partnership with Villiers, and that's, like I say, how I got the original bike. And I tried so hard to leverage that after, this is a couple of years down the road, to get it was the Villiers Zero when it came up. Was it the Zero? It's their lightweight climbing bike. I think it's still being made.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried so hard to get one of those, using every contact I could, pestering them. No dice. I was like, what's the good of having a partnership if you can't get a bike for your drivers? And didn't go anywhere.
Let me guess, you wanted it in the Ramato chrome and bronze.
Of course.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What else would you choose? The benefit is that you do see, like even now, McLaren have a bunch of specialized bikes in the paddock, which they just run around, and they're all 10 years old, obviously, because that partnership ended a while ago. But they're still using them and still giving specialized free exposure outside the Red Bull motorhome. You'll always see a rack of like 10 BMC bikes of varying specs and ages. So that's quite cool.
Going the other way, there's so many former F1 engineers or aerodynamicists or somebody from the design department who are transferring across to cycling teams, cycling brands, cycling design work. I heard Jerry Anderson, he felt, I think it was, maybe I'm misquoting him, but I'm pretty sure it was Jerry Anderson, former Jordan F1 race engineer. He had mentioned that if he was coming up in today's F1 world, he might not even get a start because they're so highly qualified. Everybody joining F1 teams these days is so highly qualified that there isn't a chance for someone who maybe doesn't have the pieces of paper behind them, but has the brain to do some really impressive work within F1. And he worried that maybe he wouldn't get the start. And then I hear the likes of Dan Bigham mention that when he was at Mercedes F1, he was sort of pigeonholed into working only on wing mirrors. And he spent basically night and day for a year designing and redesigning and optimizing the wing mirrors of an F1 car. It seems like cycling now is offering these professionals a real avenue to enjoy the design freedom that cycling brands offer them and sort of get to work on every aspect of the bike. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Is that an attraction? And is it maybe F1's loss and cycling's gain?
I think 100%. What Dan and Jerry are describing, I think, are very accurate reflections of where F1 is at from an engineering perspective, which is kind of sad because the idea is that F1 should be the pinnacle of engineering performance, prowess. It should be an intellectual sport as much as a physical one. But the reality is that in these multi-$100 million teams, that per year, that's what they're spending. They have enough resource that they can assign minuscule details to individuals rather than getting one person to do a whole bunch of different things, because from their perspective, that's just not efficient. And so it's created over many decades, but it has sort of morphed into this very segmented style where every team has departments that are very split, very siloed off from each other, and they do their one thing and they try to do it to absolute perfection, which can be attractive to some. And I think the brand of F1, as it were, is enough to keep others engaged. But for people like Dan, who clearly is a fantastic engineer and has the kind of mind that would have been brilliant in F1 40 years ago, where he probably could have designed a whole car by himself if he so wanted, cycling offers a much better opportunity. And I think a lot of people get frustrated with that. Even a lot of my friends from previous F1 teams, they often speak of that frustration and either end up moving into a different industry or to a different series in motorsport where regulation is not as tight, like sports car racing, where the new prototypes that they've launched for Le Mans, 24 hours, and these kind of things, there is a much more blank slate to work from. There's still a lot of regulation, but relatively, it's more free.
Just as you're talking there, I'm pretty sure it was actually Adrian Newey who had said that. So I've mixed up my Formula One experts there, but if I remember correctly, what Adrian Newey had actually said also was that when he started in Formula One in the 70s or 80s or whenever that was, he was the junior aerodynamicist with the first team that he joined, and it actually meant he was the head aerodynamicist also, because there only was one aerodynamicist within the team.
Yeah,
and
he just happened to be junior. Yeah.
Fast forward today, and Ferrari or something like that maybe has 200 plus aerodynamicists alone, not to mention all the other elements that go into designing a car. So there's sort of this, I think within the cycling industry, while someone like myself maybe welcomes the sort of designs and the thinking behind some of the designs that these former F1 engineers are coming up with in terms of what they're doing in the cycling space, there is also a bit of a running joke in terms of it worked in F1, so it'll sell bikes in cycling, rather than there actually being any transferable benefits from one sport to the other. I mean, it's maybe not a fair question to ask of you, but how much do you think is actually transferable, and how much is maybe just the marketing department again going into overdrive?
50-50, I'd
Okay.
say. There's definitely some stuff which, even in the time that I've been cycling, which is a tiny amount of time, like I say, it's, I think, 4 or 5 years I've been riding bikes properly. And even in that time, we've gone from bikes that had cables out in the wind by default, aero tube shaping. I remember the first bike I had, that Villiers that I was given, it was one of their low end models, Gran Turismo GTR with Tiagra. Brilliant bike. Still have it in my garage.
I mean,
It's
that's a heck of a first bike.
I know, yeah. It's really, really cool. And it's in a very Italian color scheme as well. So I love it. But it is crashed and dead. But I keep it for the memories. But that bike, the blurb on the website had a whole thing about aerodynamics. And I remember laughing when I got the bike because the down tube is just a triangle. Like, and a triangle with the pointy end facing forwards. So it's like the opposite to a camtail that we have now, where obviously you have relatively the blunt side facing the air, and then it's a teardrop going back on your fork legs or whatever. But it was just like, yeah, it'll cut through the air with the point of the triangle, and then don't worry about what happens behind. Like, it just made me laugh. But that was the state of the game kind of back then, more or less. Some brands were doing it better than others. And now, fast forward, we've got bikes that are all kind of iterating to looking quite similar, because they're all iterating to what is the best solution, which is always a sign of, they're getting towards some marginal gains. And it's really impressive. And some of the solutions that they're talking about, and the sophistication of the CFD modeling, and the extent of the wind tunnel testing that they're going through, and even things like rolling resistance and how tire manufacturers are focusing on that, and the gains being made with different materials. That is 100%, kind of motorsport, high end, almost Formula One spec processes. So I think there is a lot of truth to it, but you'll always have a big slice of the marketing budget pushing things as well. It's always going to be there, right? It was one of your podcasts, I think I was listening to, maybe it was Dave Rome. He said one of his favorite games was to take a press email with a new product that had come in, just blank out the product name, and then try and guess what the product was. Because they all say the same thing, don't they? Stiffer, lighter, more aerodynamic, better by 10%. And it's always the truth, isn't it?
There's also, the fact that for a long time, even the aero data we were getting was sort of cherry picked, and that you could almost say any bike was faster if you tested it at the right yaw angle, or if you tested it in the right way. You would find some bit of data that you could use to hang your hat on and say, this is the fastest version of this bike we've ever made. And then it's also lighter and stiffer and more comfortable and everything under the sun. And I feel that's really unfortunate, because actually then we tend to just sort of laugh everything off or tar everything with the same brush. And there is obviously always going to be some genuine innovation out there that is pushing the boundaries of bike design and aerodynamics and cycling especially. And I think it's also maybe cycling's always going to be playing a catch-up game in terms of aerodynamics is so relatively new to the sport, and carbon fiber also still relatively new, that just because what we were doing 10 years ago, we can now look back on and say, well, in hindsight, that was absolutely ludicrous. That wouldn't work at all. Like your triangular tubed willier there. But there probably is an argument that at the time, the brand maybe did, that was the cutting edge of the understanding at that time.
Literally the cutting edge. It's a very sharp edge.
Yeah. So I think we need to at least give the industry a little bit of leeway on that one. I think for me, we will always be playing that catch-up game, and looking from the outside in, it seems to be that motorsport, surprisingly enough, where your sport has moved on to is actually in terms of improving sustainability and lowering carbon footprint, and moving on from carbon fiber actually to use new materials that are less environmentally harmful. Is that a fair reflection, do you think? Is that happening, or is that just my perception?
Definitely the sustainability push is a thing. I think we're seeing that across all sports worldwide, but motorsport has always had a bit more of a target on it because of the obvious extra emissions that are created from the cars themselves. Although I have to say that that's more of a perception problem, because frankly, the emissions created during a Formula One race, or even a race like the Le Mans 24 Hours, is dwarfed by the emissions of moving the paddock, picking it up, packing it, and sending it by air freight or shipping freight to the next race, and the plane emissions that come from all of the drivers and personnel flying into that location. It is a drop in the ocean, relatively speaking, which is why I laugh. And I can say this now because I'm not related to a Formula One team official anymore. I laugh when I see F1 making their big push of sustainability and sustainable fuels. So they're sourcing their fuel more sustainably than they used to. And indeed, the cars are a lot more efficient with their fuel than they used to be. But weekend to weekend, the calendar makes no sense geographically. It's just whoever wants their slot at which time in the year. So you'll see races where we fly from Australia to the Middle East, like within a couple of weeks of each other, and then back over to the Far East for a race in China. Then a few weeks later, it's off to America, then to Europe, then back to America or back to Canada. And they don't group races together to make it easier for people to stay out there, or for shipping containers to stay out there. There's no consideration for that. And it's absolutely ludicrous. But it's not talked about because that's not what the perception of Formula One is. It's the cars are spewing carbon dioxide into the air. We need to fix that. They need to be hybrid, and so on and so forth. But there is a push. All of our fuel for Le Mans 24 Hours this year came from, technology where they're using, hesitate to say because I think I might be wrong, but Total were providing the fuel. I think it came from rapeseed. I'm not even going to say it. There was some push around the fuel being sustainably sourced rather than just being the bog standard stuff. So it's definitely getting better. I have a hint of pessimism around some of that stuff, but it's good to see it being talked about at least.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, there was I think it was maybe back in April, there was a F1 race in the Middle East, Azerbaijan, Baku, and then over to Miami, and then back to Monaco. And there just seemed to be no rhyme or reason to that, other than, as you say, the race itself maybe doesn't have that massive an impact. Certainly, maybe not as much as perceived. But everything that goes into making the F1 show, that's really where the problem is. And I think that's kind of the same across many sports. Football's kind of the same in that you have, the teams maybe have to travel, but the private jets full of VIPs and different delegates and different officials certainly don't have to be traveling, over and back across Europe 2-3 times per week just to watch a football match that they can see on TV at home. And cycling itself is no better. The Tour de France, for all the talk about the bike riders in that race, the entourage and the vehicles, and even just the publicity caravan that both follows and goes ahead of the race. It's one of those things you really need to see it in person just to understand how big that is. So yeah, a lot of sports have a lot of catching up to do in that space, I think.
Yeah, I think that there's no easy answer to that question. So that's why so many organizations are still struggling with it. On the materials side, I think you mentioned as well, things like are there more sustainable materials coming out from this push as well. Carbon fiber, at least in motorsport, is still absolute king. That there hasn't been a material found yet that can replicate that level of strength, ease of use as well in terms of the manufacturing process, and lightweight factor as well. But we are seeing different materials being used in tires. So traditionally, the production of rubber tires was a pretty dirty process and has a lot of pretty nasty additives in it as well to keep the rubber from going bad, to extend life, to make it perform better in certain heat conditions. And interestingly, in the last couple of years, motorsport as a whole has been finding it quite difficult, but been slowly switching over to not using a lot of those additives anymore. That could be harmful to the environment and that produce a lot of toxins during the production process. So manufacturers like Pirelli, Hankook, Continental, they are involved in motorsport as well, have been eliminating these things. And interestingly, you see that tire performance has gone down across the board. There was a spate of, or a period where tire failures were much more common in certain racing series across the world, and performance was not as strong. So clearly, those additives were doing a job. You have to find substitutes and other things that can, replace them. And it's not as easy as just eliminating them because they look bad on paper. At the end of the day, they were there because they were helping to make a better product. So it's not easy, but there are things that are going in the right direction.
Yeah, I was blown away to find out that when an F1 tire is removed from a rim, even if it hasn't been used, it's for the bin at that point. Cannot be reinstalled. Which, when you consider just how many tires each car and each team are going through in a weekend, to then be also wasting tires that have never actually been driven on track, just blew my mind and got me a little bit worried, because I sense that actually a lot of people are sort of switching on to how much benefit you could get from tires in terms of bike racing. And as you mentioned there, lower rolling resistance and improved aerodynamics and better grip, and how those three things could actually make not a marginal gain, but a huge difference in terms of performance. Hopefully we don't end up going down the same wasteful track when cycling goes down that road. I think we all want better tires, but part of that should be increased durability also. And all right, folks, Ronan here again, and this is where we would normally cut you off if you're not a member of Escape Collective, but since we're feeling generous this week, since it is the start of the Formula 1 season, since we are hearing from Jack Aitken, a former Formula 1 driver, we thought we'd just roll out this entire episode for everybody, regardless of whether you're a member or not. But we do hope that you take kindly to us providing this entire episode free and decide to support what we're doing here at Escape Collective and sign up to become a member, and in future get all the episodes of Performance Process uninterrupted. Thank you. I want to go back to the sort of F1ification of cycling, as some are referring to it as. So we've talked a bit about the engineers coming back and forth and the aerodynamics, and we had that silly grid start in the Tour de France a few years ago. Were you into cycling at that point where they had?
I did see that. Yeah,
that was one of the worst attempts at improving any excitement in the Tour de France. But anyway, they tried, so we have to give.
It was quite funny to watch how casually they rolled away from their preassigned positions. A real fight for the first corner. Brilliant.
Yeah, it may have worked, had it actually started not a kilometer from the bottom of the climb, but actually halfway up the climb, or I don't know, maybe at the very top of the climb, or I don't know. But I don't think anybody wants to see that coming back. What I was going to get to is, have you seen the race radio broadcasts in the Tour de France?
Yep. Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. It's nice to see that kind of insight, because I think it's something that we have a lot in motorsport in F1 particularly. And, anything that you can do to get across more of the story of the race to casual viewers, it's really good.
What I was specifically going to ask you about is, do you think having listened to a few of those broadcasts now, do you think the cycling teams and the riders could learn a bit from motorsports and maybe just being a bit more efficient with their wording over the radio? Like, those things are pretty hard to hear when you're on the go. And the sentences, what struck me so far about listening to the broadcast was just how long and drawn out some of the conversations are. And you compare that to, Formula One, for example. They're not saying, "Okay, Fernando, it's time for a pit stop. We're going to put you on soft tires. You can come in at the end of this lap." It's literally just box, and
Yeah.
So, did that strike you at all? How well, first of all, how difficult it is to hear, and to their credit, there, it's going to be easier to put a decent radio into a car than it is on a rider's back pocket. So I can
It's
understand
about the
that element
same
of it.
quality as
Okay.
what we experience. I mean, I think it's always hard. Yeah, I think maybe one of the differences is, at least for a lot of the broadcasts today, where the pace wasn't really on, you can afford to be more relaxed, I guess. It's not as crucial, but for sure in the last kilometers when people are fighting for position and people screaming in the peloton, or fans on the side of the road that are shouting as well, and it's a bit harder to hear, then yeah, it would become pretty crucial. And it's something that we talk about a lot in the teams that I've been a part of. It's always try to be as concise as possible. There are set words for certain things, like you say, box is a standard one for pitting. You always say copy, or my Americanisms coming through now that I race for an American team, 10-4, whatever, to make sure that you've acknowledged the message, that they know that you've heard them. Another thing is that a lot of these radios are one way. So if I'm on the radio, my engineer can't then come on and speak to me. So it makes it very critical in those parts of the race where you need communication, like at a race start, finish, a pit stop. If you're babbling on the radio and talking about, "Oh, I see some clouds over there. Maybe it's going to rain later." And did you see that overtake? It was pretty nice. Meanwhile, your engineer's on the radio, like, trying to tell you, "We need to stop now. We need to box. And it's happened before, but it's just always be efficient with your words. And it's a practice thing. And eventually you get into you get experience with it and you get used to it, and it just comes naturally.
You're in the unique position of having raced in a Formula One race, having raced bikes, racing in Le Mans, being a professional race driver. Thinking about those bike races you've done, how much of the process and the build up to a motor race is transferable across to bike racing? And specifically, I'm thinking about in a motor race or an F1 race, especially, if a mistake happens, you have to forget about it and move on as quickly as it happened, I'm assuming. And you have to be like in the moment at all times and fully concentrated. And that's something that always strikes me is, like, first of all, you can be so precise lap after lap after lap, and hit your lines and braking points and turning points almost perfectly every time. And then if you do make a slight mistake, you can't beat yourself up about it. You just have to immediately forget about it. Whereas in bike racing, you sort of have so much time to think and overthink, and rarely are you hitting the same corner twice, so you're not really having to be precise in terms of all those things I just mentioned, except for in crit racing, which is the type of racing you've done most. How much of that process could you carry across, and was it just entirely different, or was it actually replicable from sport to sport?
The things that carried over the most were just in terms of mentally gearing yourself up to perform, because I think whether it's a physical performance or a skill-based performance, a lot of the processes are the same. When you're an athlete, you want to get yourself in the right headspace and be quite level-headed as well during the actual event. So when I do the crit races, I always try and make sure that I have a routine and there's no surprises at the last minute. I don't have to pump up my tires because I've forgotten to do it the day before or the morning or whatever. I've got the nutrition I need. I know what the course is. I know my teammates are there. And it's just a feeling of being on top of things basically before you go into an event and giving yourself that peace of mind. And it's the same in the car. I have a very specific routine, very specific. It's just something that I've naturally fallen into over years and years of competing, where I'll do my warm up. I'll make sure I have my nutrition at a certain time before I get in the car. I'll have a chat with the engineer last thing, get my kit on, get ready. That kind of thing transfers quite easily. I think the actual act itself of racing, there's some fairly big differences in terms of in the car. It's like you said, mainly about extracting the performance out of the car in the circuit, maximizing, hitting those reference points again and again and again, not making mistakes and performing that skill. There is a physical element, but it's not a limitation like it is in cycling. The races that I've done in cycling, you have to balance both. It's a skill and a physical based sport, which is what makes it quite fascinating. My legs are always a big limiter. I've never been in a race where I'm like, oh, this is easy. I can basically do what I want. I've always been on towards the other end of the spectrum where I know that I have so much in the tank, and strategy therefore becomes quite important. And that's quite enjoyable because in the car, drivers don't often have the right or the information to make strategy calls. That's usually the race engineer on the pit wall, although you can have a hand in wheel-to-wheel battle. In cycling, it's much more, personal. You have to know when to go, which moves to follow, when to attack, when's good or a bad time to do that. And I really, really enjoyed learning that side of it in cycling. That's kind of what draws me to riding competitively, because it's something I haven't had the chance to do a lot. But then in the moment, especially the crit, that is more local to me. Even though it's just an airfield crit, nailing the corners, there is a way to do it. And it amazes me how many regulars come and get that corner badly wrong on the run in for the final few hundred meters of a sprint. And you can use that to your advantage. So I really enjoy perfecting that based on the wind conditions and my position in the pack and all of that sort of stuff. And going elbow to elbow with people is actually surprisingly similar to going door to door with people in a car, because racing drivers actually almost treat car as an extension of themselves. You can read the body language of another driver in their car after a lot of time. Well, I think a casual viewer can probably read the body language of a car as well, right? If you see it darting around, making quick moves, trying to intimidate another car, you know what the driver's doing. And it's the same on the bike. If you're going in for a finish and a sprint and you're trying to edge out another rider, trying to get your bars just in front of them before you show them the door, basically, it's exactly the same, even though you're just on a bike versus in a massive 1-ton piece of metal and carbon fiber. So that has a lot of similarities as well.
Rubbing is racing, yeah?
It certainly is, yeah.
I was going to ask you earlier if you were that kind of bike rider where you don't mind getting your elbows out.
I don't mind it, but I usually lose because I'm 60 kilos. So I try and avoid it when I can. I'm not really a sprinter.
There's kind of a public perception as well that, if you've got enough money in the right car, you can buy your way to the top of motorsport, regardless of athletic ability. Whereas sports like cycling followers of those sports tend to weigh the athletic ability much heavier in those sports, and maybe rightly so. But I am curious just how much improved athletic ability do you think, and just being fitter in general, actually makes the best drivers what they are, and how much do you weigh that, and how much difference does it make if you're fit or unfit getting into the car?
I think at the top levels like F1, it's unavoidable. You have to be fit. The reality is, like I said, it's never going to be, or it's very, very rarely a limitation in terms of performance. It's more that it's supplementary. So the saying is usually that you're training to give yourself capacity, not to make yourself faster. Because when you're in the car, you are performing a skill repeatedly, again and again and again, very consistently. When you are racing others on the track, especially, and you have to have the headspace for dealing with that. If you're on the limit physically, you're going to suffer. I've never really been in a situation, or very rarely, where I am physically unable to drive the car. It's only, I can count on my hand, I think it's happened twice, where you get arm pump or something because there are no power steering in a lot of these cars, right? So you do have to have a certain level of strength and endurance. Heat acclimatization is a big thing for us, because especially in the closed cockpit cars that I drive, the prototypes, you can get cabin temperatures of 45 degrees and you can be in a car for 3 hours at a time. So dehydration becomes massive, and you're basically breathing in your own sweat, which is very, very unpleasant. Yeah, it's something that most people should be able to do. If you're motivated enough to be spending money to get to F1 or getting there on talent, you're going to be motivated enough to train well enough that you're fit to do it.
Well, first of all, how much of that process that you mentioned earlier can you pick up from your bike racing and bring back to motorsport? And how much, we always seem to assume that all the understanding and all the science is coming from motorsport and Formula One especially, and down into cycling. but how much is actually going in the opposite direction? Like you mentioned there, heat acclimatization, and that's a sort of buzz topic in cycling at the moment. How much of that is carried across? Are you doing heat training sessions on the turbo trainer, and even things like, I'm just thinking now off the top of my head, altitude training and like, has any of that sort of training understanding that the sports physiologists in cycling would have made its way across into motorsport?
I think the heat training stuff is really interesting because surprisingly, maybe for people, I think F1 tends to be a little bit behind in terms of the physical training side of things, and the consideration for that isn't so big. So on something like heat acclimatization, I think they're quite behind. And it's only relatively recently that you've seen drivers start to wear cool vests on the grid before they get in the car. Teams deliberately making sure that the drink bottles that go in the car are chilled until the very last minute that they go in the car as well. Even, we have to wear fireproof suits, obviously, and you're actually wearing 2 layers of fireproof kit, what they call Nomex underwear, which is a heat resistant material, and then your fireproof overalls, which are flameproof to an extent, and they're very thick and very uncomfortable. And it's only relatively, again, I'm thinking in the last decade, manufacturers started to take on board feedback from drivers saying, could you please make it a little bit more breathable? Because it's possible to do that and still to retain the flameproof properties. So the race suits that you have now compared to even 5 years ago are much cooler for the driver. But it's taken a long time to get there. I try and do a lot of heat training on the bike, particularly on the turbo in the shed, because it naturally gets very warm, especially when you get to the summer months when we have our hotter races anyway. So it's quite easy to achieve that and to get quite a lot of sweat.
Have you got your paint suit on yet?
My paint suit?
For on the turbo trainer, sticking on a paint suit just to get the extra sweat going.
I have not done that. I'm usually it's an old hoodie that goes on, try and absorb as much of the sweat as I can instead of having it fall on my bike.
Full winter kit and a paint suit over the top of it.
Oh God,
you'll know all, and then start doing efforts. There's really nothing worse.
I can imagine. Well, that's probably the biggest one for me because, like I say, the kind of racing that I do now, really the big things that I'm fighting physically are dehydration and fueling as well. Because in the car, you can only have straight water because anything with sugars in it, even I didn't realize this until I tried it. A lot of electrolyte mix tablets or sachets or whatever, they will have bits of sugar in them or other little additives, which can gunk up the drinks tube system in the car because of the heat. And so you only have the straight water, no other means of eating anything. And like I say, you can be there for 2 or 3 hours quite easily. And often when you get out of the car, you're really not in the mood to eat because you are dehydrated. And one of the big side effects of dehydration is gastric distress. And you're sat in one position, hunched for a long time. So I often find, and many drivers find, that the prospect of eating something after you've gotten out of the car is probably way down the list of things that you want to be doing. But you have to, because in a 24-hour race, you're going to be back in the car in 4 hours, 5 hours time. So training the gut to take on food and harder conditions and that kind of heat training that you talked about are both pretty crucial for me.
And are you working with a nutritionist to sort of design the optimal meal for you that you're and the optimal time to eat it that you're getting the whole way through that stint without getting the knock, as we would call it, on the bike? And I'm sure you don't want to be getting that at the wheel.
Definitely. I haven't yet managed to achieve that in a race car because I've definitely had it on the bike. But yeah, so far managed to avoid that on in the car. I don't work with a nutritionist, especially. I have done in the past, but because teams have employed nutritionists just to educate us. But actually, that's another thing that I've taken from cycling because there's so much information out there because it's such a big topic in cycling. That is something that I can read about quite easily and learn about fairly easily. And I therefore have a good understanding of the fundamentals and the basics of what kind of nutrition I want to be taking in. So, for example, on a race weekend, even if it's Friday and therefore a couple of days out from my event, I'm not going to be taking in a lot or any vegetables and certainly not too much protein because at that stage, it's just not going to do me a lot of good. And it can contribute to gut distress when you get in the car later, especially fiber. So it's a lot of easy to digest carbs, a lot of pasta, rice, even during the race day itself. As long as it's not crazy on sugars, you can pretty much have any kind of easy white carbs like bread and whatever pasta, white rice. It doesn't have to be especially complex carbs, and actually it's probably better to avoid them. And that's something that I stick to now for a lot of my endurance events.
The one I had heard recently was a lot of World Tour riders are turning to Cocoa Pops, believe it or not.
Yeah. I've heard the cereal one is a good trick.
And perhaps even scarier is the idea of mixing Cocoa Pops and porridge, which just sounds absolutely vile.
You could crunch up the Cocoa Pops to make like a chocolate dust and then distribute that through the porridge. That wouldn't be so bad.
I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense in that, if you're going out for a high intensity interval session, Cocoa Pops are effectively rice that's popped and with tons of added sugar. And then you're mixing in a bit of porridge for a little bit of slow release carbs. And I had all these plans to sort of delve into the story when we were at the tour. But the one rider who apparently relies most on Cocoa Pops, when I asked him if this was true, he denied any knowledge of it. So either he's trying to keep the secret to himself or it's just not a thing. Sounds like you're not a Cocoa Pops lover either.
I've been advised, so I do have a coach that he's not a nutritionist, but he has some of the core values, right? And
is this a cycling coach or motorsport coach?
No, he is a cyclist who coaches racing drivers, so it's perfect for me.
Okay.
Which is great. A casual cyclist, I should say. And I've had this conversation with him because I've stumbled upon things like the Trainer Road forum. That's a great resource for me on nutrition. There's actually a lot of really useful stuff there. And one of the threads, I believe, is called Eat Trash, Ride Fast.
Okay.
Which I think is great.
I think I have seen that one, yeah.
And yeah, they do talk about different cereals that are supremely sugary per carb, per gram. And I asked him about this and he kind of pushed me away from it just because his feeling was that, especially for me, where I'm not actively necessarily burning calories at the same rate as a cyclist, that sugary intake could be more detrimental than helpful in terms of spiking blood sugar. And we have worn blood sugar sensors in the car to watch this kind of thing. So as much as I would love to, I've not had the opportunity. Mid-ride snack, I'm all about Haribo and Tang Fast Sticks is the go-to, but not in the car yet.
There's also the question of, even if something is performance enhancing, and I don't mean in terms of drugs, but in terms of Cocoa Pops in this instance. And I was stuck in an airport for a long time with a younger cyclist coming back from Filippo Ganna's hour record last year, actually. And he had mentioned Cocoa Pops and how they fuel so many of his training rides now. And I was trying to make the point that, even though it actually might be good for that single training session, and I'm probably the most guilty of this, making this mistake down through the years, you have to consider the longer term health side effects in terms of, if you're having to eat a box of Cocoa Pops to fuel a training ride, what effect is that going to have on your teeth? And if you're, yo-yoing your weight in terms of diet in season and out of season, and is that going to have effect on even things like bone density and there's a whole multitude of knock-on effects. So sounds like your coach there and yourself obviously have a wise head on your shoulders. You're not just grabbing for the gains right now. You're thinking longer, bigger picture.
I mean, you say that, but I mean, in that case, yes. But like I said, on a race weekend spanning 3 days, I basically cut out vegetables because I in particular have found that fiber is pretty bad for me in terms of getting problems with my stomach. 3 days without vegetables can't be good for you. But I make that sacrifice for those 3 days. And by the end of it, it's amazing. You'd think, oh, great, cutting out vegetables, that's not going to be a hardship, is it? It's amazing how the body craves what it knows it needs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the desire to have a fresh salad at the end of that weekend is overwhelming, which is pretty cool that your body can tell you what it wants, but also slightly worrying. So yeah, I share some of those concerns, and my trips to the hygienist have definitely gone up since I became a cyclist as well.
Well, not to dwell too long on it, but I know if you're trying to cut out fiber, it's not just the vegetables that you can't have. Actually, some foods that have high fiber content It's only when you go looking at these things that you realize, oh, there's that much fiber in that. I'm not having this today or tomorrow. Moving on and sort of just wrapping up, because I'm sure we could sit here chatting all day, but I couldn't have a podcast with a motorsport professional and not talk about rules at some point. We all love rules, don't we? And cyclists especially, you know, we're not all cyclists, but myself and let's say a group of other cyclists are constantly complaining about some of the UCI rules, and maybe also sometimes just airing our displeasure at some of the UCI's decisions in general. I want to know, considering how heavily regulated Formula One is, are you Formula One drivers as hung up on the rules and how they maybe are holding you back and how you could go faster if this rule wasn't in place? Or is it a case of, you know, you kind of accept the rules are there and that's actually the challenge? The challenge isn't how fast can you go around the track. The challenge is how fast can you go around the track under these regulations, which differs a lot to for me, I don't care for going as fast as possible under the regulations that somebody in Switzerland has, you know, in the UCI headquarters has come up with, or what their idea of a bike is. I want to know how fast can I pedal what I deem to be a bike. So is it the same? Are you guys getting hung up in the rules, or are you a bit more relaxed about it?
I think the majority are probably a bit more relaxed about it. I mean, personally, I definitely get off on beating other people rather than being a second faster by myself. You know, but at the same time, Formula One cars that I've driven in the modern era are a good 300 kilos heavier than the F1 cars that we had in the noughties. And I would kill to have a go in one of them because I know it would be spectacular and it would be that much faster in the corners, even if the power is not quite what we have now. So it's a balance. I think drivers definitely complain and moan when things are going the wrong way. So the weight of Formula One cars has steadily been creeping up for the last 20 years. And that's largely because of safety. The cars are getting bigger crash crumple zones and more protection to the survival cell of the cockpit, which are obviously necessary things, really. You can't argue against that. But there haven't been advancements made in other areas of the car to offset that. So the cars are generally less agile. They don't feel quite as lively to drive. And that kind of tactile sensation is something that you really notice as a driver. And it's a sad thing when it goes the wrong way. However, I think most people, like I say, like me, they're really there because they want to beat the other 19 drivers on the grid. And they would happily take winning versus being second, winning in a car that they necessarily might not like as much as being second in a car that they love, because you're still second and you're losing. And that, at least in my head, that's the priority. But we're not blind to it. They're definitely quite active in terms of the regulations around safety, and people get quite vocal about that, which I think is the same for cyclists from what I've seen. So that's a common ground.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because I think, you know, just thinking off the top of my head now, those of us who are most vocal about UCI rules, it tends to only be about the regulations around, you know, bike design in general, frame, wheels, aerodynamics and that. And it also tends to be the time trialists who are out there on their own trying to improve their time. Yeah. Whereas when you're in a bike race and everybody is under the same regulations, yeah, you're just trying to beat the person next to you. So that makes sense. Yeah.
It's funny because time trialing exists in motorsport, but it's not nearly as big as in cycling, which is saying something, right? Because time trialing is quite a niche, I would say, in cycling these days, at least with the full time trial setup rather than just on a road bike. But it does exist in motorsport. It usually takes the form of hill climbs, and that's, again, like cycling, a very traditional sport related to the UK. It's fantastically dangerous because they're usually on literally private lanes that lead to someone's house, manor, I should say, and they get rented out for these events where they're probably less than a few miles long. No barriers or hardly any barriers to speak of, and the cars are as wild and varied as you could imagine, because the governing body, they do have restrictions, but they're just not as resourced, I guess, as the normal governing bodies of actual races, mass start races. So if you want a laugh, go on YouTube and search up some hill climb racing and motorsport. The crashes are spectacular and the cars are pretty impressive as well.
Well, yeah, I'll definitely dig that out. It sounds a bit like the CTT time trials. Also, those are regulated, but
Yeah.
not as regulated as UCI time trials, and that's
a true hotbed of cycling development and technology.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the hotbed of time trialing development, and most of the riders, well, maybe not most, I haven't ever been to a CTT event, but it seems like a lot of time trials specializing in those events are probably a heck of a lot more optimized than even the best setups in the World Tour, which is both for fascinating and for different reasons, I think. So, well, I mean, I could sit here and chat about rules all day. I think maybe where my biggest grievance with some of the cycling regulations is that they're not applied consistently. And maybe even what I like about the FIA is that they seem to be more willing to accept when, they've maybe not worded a regulation correctly, or they haven't applied it consistently in the past, and they have to put their hands up and say, well, we haven't applied that before and you've given us a precedent, so we can't apply it this time. Or you can have a genuine appeal and have a chance of getting a verdict overturned. And it's not always the same in cycling. And the other thing I like about the FIA is, I appreciate this is the opinion of a guy who watches Formula One, but doesn't have any understanding or expertise to comment. So it is entirely my own opinion, but they seem to be quicker to respond when regulations need updated. Or, I'm thinking back to Jeddah this year, where first of all, you had the problem first 2 races of the year where drivers were lining up incorrectly in their start box. And then they implemented a protocol to ensure that didn't really happen again, or there was less chance of that happening again going forward. And also you had the whole issue with Fernando Alonso, and did the mechanic touch his car too soon, or is it Jack touching the car, a mechanic touching the car or not? And the regulations weren't all that tight in it. But by the time the next race followed around, literally a week later, they had tightened those things up. So I think that's what I would like to see more of in cycling.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I mean, you say you're outside viewer. I'm the same for cycling, but being a reader of the Escape Collective, I do see a lot of the issues that you guys have with your organizing body. To put it lightly, I think that's fair to say. Not just in terms of how they apply the rules and manage the sport at a level for the average rider, but also in higher profile stuff. The FIA have been pretty good in that sense. I mean, I can't speak in terms of, there will always be an element of politics right at the highest level, and there's a lot of money changing hands for what is at the end of the day a global multi-billion-dollar sport, I'm sure. And that's never going to be perfect. But in terms of the end user, the average racer, they're pretty good. We get rules that are applied quite consistently. There's a legitimate process of appeal. The people in charge of those decisions stewarding the races are generally qualified and seem to be pretty reasonable. It's not always the case, but yeah, I can count on my hand the number of times I've really had an issue at a major sporting event, racing event. So we're pretty lucky in that sense, and I am glad for it. And sorry for you guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could delve into Abu Dhabi 2021 and all that. I think every sport has their challenges.
Well, I was going to say, no, we're not perfect.
Yeah,
so,
well,
that's the thing. Human error is always going to play a part, right? I think that was very unfortunate because it was human error which had one of the highest consequences you could in our sport, a world championship for Formula One. But at the end of the day, you just can't eliminate that risk entirely. And that's what it was at the end of the day. It was a human with a misjudgment in the heat of the moment, sadly. But there you go.
Yeah, well, to paraphrase that evening, let's go motor racing, or it's called motor racing. Where can people see you motor racing these days? Just to finish up, I think we could chat rules all day, but we have to move it on.
Yeah, no, I race in 2 series at the moment. One in America with Cadillac Racing in IMSA, which is a sports car championship, multi-class racing, and we compete in 24-hour races like Le Mans, Daytona for American fans, Sebring, all pretty major events, which is a lot of fun. And then I also compete in Europe in something called DTM for Ferrari and a 296 GTB, which is GT racing in more of a sprint format. So you can follow me there and online on social media, Jake Can Racer, J8 Can Racer. Drop and follow and send me a message about bikes. I'm always happy to chat.
You're always up for a bike chat. Pretty sure I'm right in saying also that Escape Collective members can count you amongst their midst, that you are I know you're also an Escape Collective member, so thank you for that. One of the first signups when we launched at the beginning of this year, so that is much appreciated.
Waiting for my high five, Ronan.
I didn't.
It's got to come at some stage.
Unfortunately, my press pass doesn't get me into the likes of Le Mans and that, so
the FIA won't ban you just because you write for a certain publication, so you have a chance.
Yeah, I have a chance. All right. Well, also much appreciated is your time today. So thank you for joining us on the podcast. I think that was, I think everybody will agree in saying that was fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Always happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Ronan, do you remember when Fernando Alonso was going to start a cycling team?
I do, yes. I was just talking to this the other day. It happened a couple of times.
What do you think? Jack Aitken start a cycling team?
I mean, it seems like the next logical move, to be honest. Like, I haven't listened to that conversation. Yeah.
I think it'd be great. It is. I think he's the sort of overlap. Yeah, the overlap is fascinating to me. You would think that anyone who's driven around at 200 miles an hour, 22 miles an hour suddenly becomes a little bit less interesting, but it's just not the case. And yeah, just a really fascinating chat there you had with Jack.
These guys are just, and girls as well, are obviously highly competitive. And turns out that driving high performance racing cars isn't all that accessible, even for the professionals who do it for their job. And opportunities are incredibly limited, I guess. So from what Jack said, there's a whole host of reasons why they enjoy cycling, but I think just scratching the competitive itch is a big part of it also, and obviously keeping fit and the great outdoors, all the other reasons that we also enjoy it. But it was great to have him on the podcast. I think it was especially good because one of the podcasts I listen to most frequently, the Race Formula 1 podcast, or the Race F1 podcast, another media entity that I am a member of, but they have another member whose name happens to be Jack Aitken, who sends in questions quite often. And they have to explain each time a question comes in from Jack Aitken that it's not that Jack Aitken. And I'm just delighted that Escape Collective had that Jack Aitken on the show. We didn't not have that Jack Aitken. We had that. They have checked it. It's not that Jack Aitken. It's a different Jack Aitken. Whereas we have the Jack Aitken on the Escape Collective.
Maybe our Jack Aitken is just moonlighting as a fake Jack Aitken.
I think initially that might have been, is this the Jack Aitken? His message in this question about Formula 1? Surely he would know, but I think they clarified, and at least that Jack Aitken said he is not the Jack Aitken, and this is getting highly confusing now, but we have the real Jack Aitken. You heard his voice.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that special episode. We'll be back with another episode of Performance Process. What, a week from now? Right?
A week from now. We did say that the next episode would be Ruth Edwards. That is still going to be the next regular episode. So stay tuned for that. That's coming next week. And as we mentioned, this entire episode has gone out free to members and non-members. So if you're not a member and you want to hear from Ruth next week, be sure to sign up between now and then.
All right, that's it. See you next week. Bye, everybody.